Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, BookTube at War and a bunch of other stuff. It's my July wrap-up. So the last couple of weeks of July haven't felt like great reading weeks to me, and I've reflected on that in my last two weekly wrap-ups. But actually, when I look at the number of books I've read in July overall, I've had really quite a decent month. I don't think I've read anything massively long. Well, actually one thing that was quite long. Most of the things I've read have been fairly short, but I've got through a decent amount of stuff. So I think I've read one short story, a couple of novellas, 16 novels, one graphic novel and 9 volumes of manga. So a reasonable amount of stuff to talk about today. And what I will do in this video, as I normally do in my monthly videos, is rank those books from least favourite or least enjoyed up to most enjoyed. But before I do that, let's talk quickly about BookTube at War. So the first time that event has taken place. So it was inspired by a subscriber, DDB, which is unusual. So DDB is a fantastically supportive subscriber and commenter, even when he is ribbing me about test matches and things like that. Michael K. Vaughan, the great Michael K. Vaughan, kind of knocked the event into shape and gave it some form, and it's been interesting. I haven't read quite as many things for BookTube at War as I wanted to, but I have read a decent amount of stuff and a reasonable variety of stuff. So it was certainly interesting to have a theme to my reading. And I've enjoyed, I haven't loved everything I read for BookTube at War, but I have read some interesting things that I probably wouldn't have read otherwise. Right, so let's crack on then with the ranking. So my least favourite book of the month then was Womb by Duncan Ralston, which may not be a surprise to anyone who's watched my review of it. So this was an extreme horror novel that I read for my Disturbing Books project about a man and a woman in a motel room doing weird stuff, basically, and the guy telling the woman who's a sex worker a series of stories about weird things that have happened in that room. It was like a deliberately over the top and gross and unenjoyably shocking, I think is how I would describe it. So it goes out of its way to be shocking, but never in an interesting way. So yeah, Womb, not a book I particularly enjoyed. Just ahead of that, a British detective novel, The Waiter by A.J. Chowdhury, which was interesting in its setting. So set partly in India and partly in Britain, but focusing on the kind of British Indian or British Asian community in Britain. So that side of it was interesting. The actual detective side of it, wasn't so good. So about this guy who was a policeman in India who had to quit his job in disgrace and has come over to the UK and is now working as a waiter. So it's partly him trying to solve the case that led to his downfall in India and partly him trying to solve a new case in the UK. And it had its moments. The central character was quite decent, but it just didn't click with me as much as I hoped it would. Just ahead of that, we have The Italian Connection by Gardner Fox, the first of the Cherry Delight Executioner books. So a very cheesy, sleazy 70s, bit of 70s smut, basically, about a kind of female spy going up against the mafia by having sex with lots of people, basically. So very, very silly, very smutty, unintentionally funny at times. It was a fun read, but definitely not what I would call a good book. Just ahead of that, so a book I read for BookTube at War, Legion of the Damned by Sven Hassel. A book that I've been meaning to read for ages, or I've been meaning to try Sven Hassel for ages. He was, in the 70s in particular, and to an extent in the 80s, he was a very, very popular writer of war fiction. So this was an interesting book, so inspired by his experiences fighting in the German army. And it turns out, a commenter pointed out to me that Sven Hassel's version of events and his own involvement in, kind of the German army and terrible things that the German army did is does not quite coincide with the truth in some respects. So a lot of his versions of events have subsequently been debunked, I think. But Legion of the Jam was still quite an enjoyable and interesting novel. It was very episodic, so that was one problem I had with it. But yeah, about his experiences in the German army during the Second World War. Right, moving on then, we have Circle of the Animals by Victor Malone. So this is a book that was sent to me by the author. So this is a kind of a crime novel, but told as a stream of consciousness about this guy who's effectively been kidnapped by some of his criminal associates. And about him trying to figure out, what's going on and why it's going on. So it was definitely interestingly written, kind of experimental. I didn't love it, but it definitely gripped me, and I definitely thought it was very interesting. So yeah, worth checking out if you fancy something a bit different from a work of crime fiction. Moving on then, so just ahead of that, another one I read for BookTube at War, Powder Monkey by Adam Hardy, the first of his Fox novels. So this is a series of novels about a sailor in the British Navy during, now I'm going to forget what, it was at the time of the Revolutionary War in America. I can't remember what century it was, but yeah, so this was a fun, pulpy, slightly trashy read. These were books that were kind of churned out in the 70s by New English Library, so quite brutal at times, quite explicitly sexual at times, and again, like the Sven Hassel book, quite episodic, but definitely enjoyable. So this first book in the series about Fox as a boy, kind of growing up and becoming a ship's boy in the Navy and getting involved in kind of battles and stuff like that. So it was an entertaining read. Right, just ahead of that then, we have Beheaded by Guyan Smith and J.R. Park, which was a fairly recent British horror novel. I think came out in 2021, and co-authored by Guyan Smith, a very well-established British horror writer. This was actually his last book before his death, and J.R. Park, who's a much newer writer and also co-owns the publishing company that put this book out. So it was an entertaining horror novel. The plot was quite kind of cheesy, so about terrible events that happened in this house 100 years previously. This woman and her abusive husband now live there, and terrible things start happening again. But the scenes of the kind of horror scenes in it were really quite well done, so I did quite enjoy that. Just ahead of that, we have Elder Race by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which was my Patreon book club read for this month. So a book chosen by my patrons. So this was entertaining. It wasn't amazing. I think everybody else enjoyed it more than me. I struggled to get into the kind of science fiction fantasy side of it a bit, and indeed made a video about that. But it had a lot of kind of inventiveness, had two really interesting central characters. So it's about this kind of world where there's a guy whose job is to just kind of observe and see what's happening on the planet. And there's this woman who's a princess who comes to him and takes him on a quest. So it was about this kind of clash of cultures between the two of them. It was definitely an interesting book and had some very interesting concepts in it, but for some reason it didn't quite click with me. Just ahead of that then, The Two Faces of January by Patricia Highsmith. So I read this, Buddy read this with Anne from the channel Anne Novella, in our ongoing project to read all of Patricia Highsmith's fiction. So this was kind of mid-tier Highsmith. It was good for a lot of it, but it felt like it fumbled the ending a bit, to be honest with you. So about a guy who's like a con man, who's travelling around Europe, so living in Greece, who kills a policeman who's been investigating him or has challenged him about his activities, and then goes on the run with his wife, and they pick up this younger American guy who's out there as well, and it's kind of about the relationship between the three of them. So it was good, and Highsmith does that kind of character really, really well, who's kind of living on the edges of like normal society. So that side of it was good, but yeah, the plot I think I felt could have done with a bit more work. Ahead of that then, The Neon Rain by James Lee Burke, the first of his Dave Robichaux novels. So a detective novel set in New Orleans from the 80s. I didn't like this as much as I expected to. There was something about the writing that meant I just couldn't quite connect with it. But the actual story and some of the events are really, really good. So a very solid detective story. Dave Robichaux, the central character, I thought was a really interesting central character. And it's definitely got a bit of punch to it. So there's some really good action sequences and things like that. So I think I'm definitely going to try some more James Lee Burke. But this one, it felt like there was something about the prose style, as I say, that felt like a bit of a blocker between me and the story. So good but not great will be my verdict on that one. Just ahead of that, a book I listened to as an audiobook, The Grey Man by Mark Greaney. So a definitely very cheesy thriller, but really enjoyable. So about this guy, the Grey Man, who's like a top international assassin, who basically gets betrayed, and loads of other assassins are now out to get him, including his old handler. And it was just really fun. So and I said this in my weekly wrap up, it really relies on stereotypes, and particularly national stereotypes. So just ridiculous kind of stiff upper lip British men and kind of dodgy Europeans and things like that. And like dodgy lawyer, like slimy lawyer type characters, all the different sorts of stereotypes you can think of are in this book. But the plot is really, really engaging, and the action sequences were just fantastic. Really, really well done. Really kind of cinematic. I thoroughly enjoyed the action, and the plot was decent enough to keep me going. So I can definitely see myself reading more of the Grey Man books. There are a bunch of them. Just ahead of that then, something completely different. So The Unknown Ajax by Georgette. So I read this as a buddy read with Heidi, one of my patrons. So this is a Regency romance from, I think, the 50s. 1959. So just really, really enjoyable. So about this family and a cousin of theirs so the family live kind of down south in the UK. The cousin is from Yorkshire, and he comes to stay with them to discuss an inheritance. And there's just a wonderful kind of lightness of touch to the writing in this book. Some very, very funny scenes. That a lot of the characters are really interesting and all have their own little storylines going on as well. And you've got like a central romance to it as well between one of the women from down south and the guy Hugo who's come down from Yorkshire, and just some lovely kind of culture clash type comedy in it. I really, really enjoyed it, and definitely want to try some more Georgette. So yeah, I can see why she was so popular back in her day. Right, just ahead of that then, another one I read for BookTube at War, Eleni by Nicholas Gage. So this was actually sent to me by the aforementioned DDB, who ranked it as one of his favourite books. So this is I said at the start I'd read 16 novels, didn't I? This is actually non-fiction, it's not a novel. So Nicholas Gage is an investigative reporter. I get my teeth in. Eleni was his mother, so she was executed during the Greek Civil War in the 1940s, having managed to get Nicholas and the rest of her children out of the country. And basically, this is her biography. So this is him investigating what happened to her, trying to figure out, why she was executed, who was involved in her execution, and writing the story of her life as a result. So it was a really, definitely a heartfelt book, an interesting examination of the Greek Civil War, which is, something that it doesn't really get discussed very much nowadays, and a wonderful tribute by a son to his mother. So a really powerful book, very gripping. I did think it was maybe a little bit too long, so it's over 600 pages long, but it definitely gripped and moved me. Right, okay, another buddy read just ahead of that. So Stella Maris and The Passenger, I'm going to count these as one book because I really do think they need to be read together. So Cormac McCarthy's final two books, which I did a buddy read of with another one of my patrons, MJ from the channel Reading This Life. So this was they're a strange couple of books. So about this brother and sister, The Passenger concentrates more on the brother, Stella Maris concentrates more on the sister, and about their relationship. There's some as is often the case with Cormac McCarthyy, there's kind of some weirdness going on around the edges as well. Some of the writing is fantastic, and Stella Maris, in fact, is basically just a conversation between the sister and her psychiatrist. The whole book is just one conversation, and it works really, really well. I preferred Stella Maris, in fact, to The Passenger, which I felt was a bit too long and it kind of lost me at times. So, interesting books, definitely interesting to read, definitely recommend reading both of them back to back. I think the thing that has surprised me about these books, when I finished reading them, for sort of 24 hours afterwards, my mind was kind of buzzing a bit with ideas and concepts and things like that from the books. Subsequently, I haven't thought about them at all, which suggests to me that, for me anyway, as a reader, Cormac McCarthyy didn't achieve, what he was trying to get. They didn't. I don't feel like they've left a lasting impression on me, although they are definitely interesting books. Just ahead of that then, something very different. Again, books I read for BookTube at War. So again, I'm going to count these two together because they are two novellas. The first two in a series, which I hope will be an ongoing series because I really enjoy both of them. So by Max Allan Collins, who's a very well-established and prolific crime writer, with some lovely illustrations by an artist called Faye Dalton. So the books are Fancy Anders Goes to War, Who Killed Rosie the Riveter, and Fancy Anders For the Boys, Who Killed the Hollywood Hostess. So two novellas about this woman, Fancy Anders, who's like a detective in Los Angeles in the 40s during the Second World War. So these are stories about kind of the American home front. And they were just really fun, just really, really enjoyable, kind of breezy mystery novels or novellas. Just both of them were I was just grinning while I was reading them. They're really, really entertaining. Fancy Anders is a fantastically kind of feisty central character. The illustrations, as I say, by Faye Dalton are lovely. They really do add something to the books. I had a really, really good time with both of these, and they're super cheap as well. They're like really, really cheap on Kindle, so definitely recommend checking them out. Right, ahead of that then, we're going to get into some manga now. So now that I'm not doing separate manga videos, I am going to start talking about manga in my wrap-up videos. So, just ahead of Fancy Anders then, we have Berserk volumes 8 and 9, which I read in this huge deluxe edition, which is incredibly heavy. So by Kentaro Miura. It's a very long-running kind of fantasy with elements of horror series about this guy called Guts, who's got a huge sword and kind of has all sorts of adventures. Where I am at the moment in the series, it's kind of flashback type stuff from where the series started, and about him travelling around with this band of mercenaries, and in particular his relationship with two of them, Casca, who's a female mercenary, and Griffith, who's the head of the mercenary group. And they're just really, really involving, and you really come to care about these characters in a way I wasn't expecting to when I started reading the series. There's fantastic kind of battle sequences, and they're incredibly violent and things like that. But there's an artistry to the way the characters are created as well, and Guts in particular has quite a lot of depth to him, and his relationship, his kind of evolving relationship with Casca in particular, I thought it was really quite sensitively handled. So a very, very interesting and enjoyable manga series. Definitely dark, definitely very violent, but it has got a bit of heart as well. So I'm enjoying that very much. Just ahead of that, so I read 5 volumes this month of Blood on the Tracks. Which is by Shuzo Oshimi, which is a fantastically disturbing series of books about a woman who's clearly kind of mentally ill and her relationship with her teenage son. And these books go to all sorts of different places. They're incredibly quick to read because they're very, very light on dialogue. I'm not going to say too much because I think I'm going to do a video. Now I've read the first 10 volumes, I think I'm going to do a video where I discuss volumes 1 to 10. So 6, 7, 8, 9 and 10 I read this month. And in fact, 7, 8, 9 and 10 I read back to back this morning. I just couldn't put them down. But yeah, really, really disturbing stuff. The story kind of revolves around the fact that right at the start, in the first volume, the mother pushes the son's cousin off a cliff, basically, and it's about them kind of hiding that crime and what that does to their relationship and what it does to the mental health of the son. So really, really interesting, very dark, very disturbing. The artwork, I think, is fantastic, and really, really, it feels like you're reading a movie in terms of the way the panels of the comic are kind of laid out like images on a film screen, on a movie theatre screen. So I'm really, really enjoying this series, but it's hard to take at times. It's really, really bleak. Just ahead of that, some more manga. So we are into my top. We're well into the top 5 now. So this is 4. 3 more books to go, I think, ahead of this. Yeah, 3 more to go. So I'm counting these as one. So this is Monster, volumes 5 and 6, by Naoki Urasawa. So this is a fantastic series. I'm really, really enjoying this. So I think there's 9 volumes in total. So I'm 2/3 of the way through now. And again, I think when I've finished all 9, I'll do a full review video. It's just brilliant. So it's like it kind of reads a bit like an 80s spy novel. And it's about this Japanese doctor who's in Germany and who gets wrapped up with these 2 twins who it turns out came from this kind of mysterious orphanage. When their parents get killed, or the people who are looking after them get killed, and the doctor saves the life of one of the twins. And the story then evolves from there, with the twins having grown up, and like strange murders happening and things like that. It's just fantastic. There's so many different characters that get drawn into the story. So the doctor character is definitely the central character, but you get loads of other characters who get drawn in just for a few chapters. But he does a really, really good job of creating all of them as convincing characters, and you'll quite often have characters come back, like a volume or 2 later on, and you'll remember who they are. Fantastic artwork. It's just really, really engaging, and loads of little subplots and side stories and things like that going on, but in a way that works fantastically. So it's definitely my favourite manga series that I'm reading at the moment. I think it's absolutely phenomenal. Right, just ahead of that then, so not a manga but a graphic novel, so not dissimilar. I don't quite know what the distinction is other than manga is Japanese. Maybe that's the only distinction. So Charley's War by Pat Mills and Joe Colquhoun, which is a British war comic that started in the 70s and ran into the 80s. So I read the first volume of the collected edition, again for BookTube at War. This was just great. So set in the First World War, about a young guy, Charley, who signs up to fight in the army, like too young. So I think he's like 16 or something like that. It's below the age he should have been anyway. And just about his life on the front and his relationship with the different soldiers that he fights with, his life in the trenches. A lot of the early kind of chapters in it involve him like writing letters home, and you can see these letters he's written home alongside his actual life in the trenches. Really, really bleak. The artwork is just phenomenal, and Joe Colquhoun, the artist, I think sadly died quite young, but his work on this is just fantastic. Pat Mills is one of my favourite comic writers anyway, and this was one of the things by him I hadn't read. It's really, really powerful, really involving, but really kind of gripping and exciting as well, as you'd expect. Something that was, basically churned out in a weekly war comic aimed at kind of teenage and younger boys in Britain in the 70s. So it's definitely full of action, but there's a real depth to it as well. I really do think it's a fantastic achievement. Just ahead of that then, so the short story I read from this Dennis Wheatley collection, Shafts of Fear. So the short story by Charles Birkin was A Lovely Bunch of Coconuts, which I did a separate video on. A fantastically disturbing short horror story set in a concentration camp during the Second World War. I won't say more than that, but if you like disturbing fiction, this I thought was really, really excellent. It's got a twist at the end, and it's one of those stories where you know what the twist is going to be before you get to it, and somehow that makes it even more horrible. I really thought it was fantastic. And then my favourite book of the month was this, The Naked and the Deadly by Lawrence Block, edited by Robert Dice and Wyatt Doyle. So Bob Dice, the publisher, sent me a copy of this. And it was fantastic. I absolutely loved this. So Lawrence Block is a well-known American crime writer who's been writing for decades. This book collects stories and articles he wrote for men's adventure magazines during the 50s and 60s. So men's adventure magazines were like hugely successful and popular back in the day, and featured, kind of exploitative articles and short fiction and salacious artwork and things like that. So this collects some of the stuff that Block wrote for those. I am going to do a full review of it because I thought it was so good. It deserves more attention. But it's got a few articles about things like prostitution, peeping toms. There's an article supposedly written by a guy who works as like an orderly in a mental hospital. There's one about kind of sexy stewardesses and things like that. So the kind of slightly cheesy, sleazy kind of stuff you might expect, but all written very, very engrossingly and entertainingly. And then you also get, I think, 5 novellas by Block as well. So 3 of them about a detective called Ed London, and then another couple about kind of a spy type character called Evan Tanner. Is it Evan Tanner? I think it was Evan something anyway. Really, really fun, and a beautifully put together book. It's got lovely kind of reprints of covers and things like that from the old magazines, and kind of, you can see how the stories were originally presented. Just pure enjoyment from beginning to end. It's one of those books I feel like this book was created for me because it's so much the kind of thing that I enjoy. So yeah, if you like that kind of vintage crime and pulpy type stuff, 100% recommend this. It's absolutely fantastic. So I hope you found that interesting. I hope you all had good reading months in July. Let me know what you've been reading. Let me know if you've read any of the things I talked about. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.